In 1922, a German production company called Prana Film took Bram Stoker's then 25-year-old novel and copied his homework, making sure to change some of the answers so that international copyright law, which at this point in cinema's infancy was closer to the Wild West than the surveillance state we know it as today, wouldn't catch on. At least, this is the story of Nosferatu's original production that's been propagated over the past century. Counterarguments exist that the film, which in fact makes no secret of its Dracula roots, merely changed the names and locations to make it more palatable to its German audience. With both works now in the public domain, you would think the Nosferatu IP would be rendered obsolete, a loophole no longer needed to adapt Dracula for free. So why is it that Robert Eggers has spent the past decade, his entire feature filmmaking career, hell-bent on remaking a cheap decoy rather than adapting the original? Well, whether the explanation for Nosferatu's cheeky little switcheroo is a matter of legal maneuvering or the product of market research on the film's projected demographic, I find the reality of Nosferatu's origin pretty drab relative to the mythological quality the film itself has taken on as a cultural artifact. Mythological may be a hyperbolic word, but for one, there's an easy comparison to draw here between the altered names between book and movie, and the altered names between Roman and Greek mythology. Poseidon has Neptune, Dracula has Orlok, etc. Werner Herzog smears this line in his 1979 remake by including the Dracula character names while preserving all the other changes of Nosferatu. But more importantly, I don't think it's exactly controversial to call F.W. Murnau's film influential. This influence is perhaps overshadowed by the original novel's contribution to the past 100+ years of pop culture and horror writing, coupled with the mannerisms immortalized by Bela Lugosi's turn in the role. Nosferatu's only real leg up in the public eye is, of course, SpongeBob, but for its Goliathan cultural impact, across the span of written literature, Dracula is relatively contemporary and founded on centuries of tradition. Nosferatu, on the other hand, has a much more foundational role in the development of its respective medium's conventions, having been produced so early in cinema's life cycle. It pioneered the art form by necessity. For instance, adapting to visual language a story originally told through the framing device of letters and journal entries and newspaper clippings rather than specifically following characters through omniscient narration, required Murnau and company to develop a style where we rapidly shift our sense of protagonist across the ensemble. This story is bigger than any one person, and the collective itself becomes one big character. This is a quality we often attribute to early Soviet montage, but Eisenstein wouldn't make his first feature for another 3 years after Nosferatu. This is to say nothing of the film's achievements in the horror genre specifically. Here's Eggers talking about Murnau basically inventing jump scares.
Nosferatu, in very many ways, invented horror films. There's horror films earlier, for sure, but like this is the one, and I think when Hutter throws the lid off the sarcophagus in the castle, that was a jump scare. When the first mate tears open the crate and the rats come out and he sees the superimposition of Orlok, that was a jump scare.
Now maybe this is an unnecessary point to hammer home for Nosferatu. After all, I wouldn't need to sit here and defend the stance that, I don't know, The Odyssey is a seminal work. But I stress Nosferatu's significance as a piece of cinematic blueprint because I believe this is the real value of remaking the film. To choose Murnau over Stoker is to invoke a relationship not just with the text, but with the images through which they were first interpreted. And that's the angle I want to look at Eggers' latest from. Paired side by side with the original film, or even Herzog's version, which, despite its more verite camera moves, is incredibly painterly in its color and composition, Eggers' film may seem at first like the epitome of modern horror lighting, with less emphasis on rim lighting or character silhouettes, and a more muted dynamic range. But paired up against any of its actual contemporaries, it's clear that Eggers and D.P. Yaron Blaschke are operating on a different caliber. Rather than the gray mud of poorly graded log video that we get with most horror these days, the stark color palette of Nosferatu seeks to modernize black and white cinematography, to translate the feeling of silent era images without the potential pretense of actually shooting black and white. The town of Visborg has a monochromatic design. The tungsten interiors and torchlit sequences evoke the silent era practice of tinting film, in this case sepia. Also common with this practice was blue tinting to accomplish day for night, thus the film's nighttime photography employs a similar technique of emulating the moon's hard light that is more naturalistic than its German expressionist influences, yet still hyper-stylized. You could argue that I'm reading into these decisions too closely and imagining more interplay with silent era aesthetics than there really is because I've been primed by the previous iterations of the film, and Really, the room is just a warm color temperature. The curtains are just blue. It's not that deep. But I'm arguing that these associations are exactly what Eggers is asking us to keep in mind by choosing to adapt Nosferatu rather than Dracula itself. To think about the film not in terms of gothic grandiosity, such as Coppola indulged with his Dracula movie, but in terms of something much more jagged and compact. Eggers has always been a man of intimate drama at heart. Even when he tried to make an ostensible epic with The Northman, he pretty immediately took the mask off and planted us in a small, rural environment to assume control over his pressure cooker. The Visburg sets of Nosferatu are by design not expansive, evoking a soundstage, and thus doubling down on small-scale intimacy, even in his most globe-trotting film to date. So far, I've described the cinematography in pretty general terms, and in all fairness, I believe that the original Nosferatu itself is largely a mood piece, but there are also specific visual indicators recreated here, echoing Murnau's original intent and repurposing it, particularly the motif of Orlok's shadow, which here receives even more screen time than the actual prosthetic body of Bill Skarsgård's demon. The Count himself is one of the film's biggest visual departures from the source material, where Klaus Kinski's Orlok, almost too visible in his movie, might as well be wearing a Max Schreck costume. Eggers' team seems hell-bent on making Skarsgård less rodent-like and more believable as an actual person, ancient supernatural being he may be. More importantly though, 90% of the time his design is cloaked in darkness anyway, and presumably not just to mask his uncanny resemblance to Jim Carrey's Dr. Robotnik. This clash of light and shadow is the foundation of Murnau's original work, but rather than using it to turn Orlok into an abstract symbol of darkness, Robert Eggman uses it to transmute Nosferatu into something much more personal. At its core, this is a movie about your friends not liking your girlfriend, and feeling emasculated by her ex. It's about being afraid of the things you're attracted to, and being honest about your most self-destructive desires. Where Herzog's interpretation centers Orlok himself, exploiting the inherent tragedy of his immortal existence and the internal strife Kinski conveys regarding his unfulfilled sexual impulses, Eggers mostly keeps Orlok out of sight. Where Kinski whimpers in self-pity, Skarsgård dominates with masculine, sexual aggression, even from such great visual distance. The idea of Orlok is scarier than the man himself here, and the domineering command of Skarsgård's voice in the performance evokes a stature not humanly possible, the outsized image conjured by the mere thought of him. And this premise generates the tension between Hutter and Ellen that is central to the film, as their relationship slowly erodes. Orlok looms over them as a literal threat bringing the plague to Visburg, and he looms over them as the paragon of a kind of sadomasochistic love Hutter is unable to fulfill in Ellen. So in this sense, we have on our hands the most humanist Nosferatu yet. These ideas and emotions are communicated through the repurposing and remixing of iconic shots and visual motifs from the original film, but for as much as Eggers twists and pulls his relationship with Murnau's images, ironically, I find that his greatest achievement here is how he prioritizes the spoken word. This is an endlessly giving script for its actors, and through a visual language of long, uncut two-shots, we get the year's most unexpected guys in rooms talking movie. To trace the trajectory of the three Nosferatu interpretations, the integration of dialogue is surprisingly linear. That is to say, Herzog's film operates almost as a silent film, plot information doled out with comical frankness and sparsity.
Count Dracula sent me a letter from Transylvania.
It's a step forward in that it, in fact, contains sound at all, but other than that arbitrary technical detail, the dialogue is no more substantive than the 1922 intertitle cards. Much hullabaloo was made over Eggers' film being the longest runtime of any Nosferatu movie, which is a strange superlative when you're comparing a whopping 3 movies to each other, but it's clear that rather than extended set pieces, this is the result of Eggers' primary fixation, the verbal playground this setting affords him. In fact, due to the nature of the story's ensemble and Eggers' writing, I can't think of the last American film that had this much nourishment for this many actors. This isn't like Oppenheimer with a couple powerhouse performances filled in by a triage of supporting roles. Everyone here passes the ball in equal measure from one to the other, and each with equivalent grace and command. Thomas Hutter, along with his original counterpart Jonathan Harker, is a character famously shafted by the narrative, responsible for its front-loading before everyone else takes over agency in the story while he's stuck in Transylvania. In Herzog's version, once he returns, he literally just sits in a corner for the rest of the movie, and then, in a twist, becomes the next Nosferatu at the end. Nicholas Hoult, however, is purely dignified as Hutter, anchoring the emotional gravity of the story while preserving a sense of nobility with his line deliveries. Side note, He's had a good year. After a string of farce, playing the butt of the joke in seemingly every movie he's been in lately, including a different Dracula adaptation from last year, in other words, a trajectory prime for playing Thomas Hutter, it's been refreshing to get two films so close together that treat him as a serious person. He's been in on the joke, of course, and has always turned in admirable work, even in a piece of shit like The Menu, but you can tell he's yearned for work like this. And then rather than being merely tacked back onto the ensemble at the end, Hutter's debilitation in the middle of the movie becomes essential to his relationship conflict with Ellen. In other words, Eggers goes to great efforts to reincorporate Hutter back into the bigger dramatic picture. It's actually kind of remarkable how much more cohesive Eggers' liberties with the script make this story in general, while adding depth to every character. Aaron Taylor Johnson is a prime example. Friedrich Harding is prominent enough in the traditional Nosferatu ensemble, but a largely uncomplicated character as opposed to his Stoker counterpart Arthur Holmwood, whereas here he becomes possibly the most internally conflicted character in the movie. He serves as a great foil to Hutter in the latent prejudice and darkness he harbors in his heart despite his charm, and considering Ellen spends more time in the Harding household than her own, I think it gives the film so much more dimension to see Orlok's reign of darkness bring Harding's destructive traits to the surface, which Taylor Johnson handles with panache and sophistication. Another side note, Taylor Johnson has sort of the opposite effect of Holt, where this movie's proximity to a great performance in Juror Number 2 bolsters the sense of Holt as a powerhouse performer through close association. The movie's proximity to a complete embarrassment like Craven the Hunter emphasizes through contrast how deliciously suave a performer Taylor Johnson is here. This is to say nothing of the strong performances in more minor roles like Jennifer Corrin's Anna Harding or Simon McBurney's Knock, as well as the delightful return of Eggers' repertory players Willem Dafoe and Ralph Ineson, the latter of whom is being criminally undersold in the film's marketing. Both doctors dignified in different ways, both given command of the narrative for significant stretches of the story, both gnawing on every gravelly word like a tough steak. You really savor the time they're on screen. Of course, the one repertory player whose absence from the film was unfortunate to read about during pre-production was Anya Taylor-Joy. To reunite with Nicholas Hoult in what is actually a good movie, along with another ATJ, and above all else continuing her run as Eggers' muse, feels like a missed opportunity necessitated by scheduling conflicts. Fortunately for Eggers, the well of actors with hyphenated names runs deep, and Lily Rose Depp is genuinely great as Ellen Hutter. It turns out her bizarre gesticulations, which rendered The Idol such an alien experience to watch, work perfectly when the source of her psychosexual demonic possession is an actual vampire, rather than The Weeknd trying to personify the big bad wolf. Her Ajani-inspired hysteria is also key to the film's exploration of archaic societal conventions. Ineson's Dr. Sievers fancies himself a man of modern medicine as he prescribes Ellen to sleep with her corset on 24/7 to combat her wailing. This moment is a piece of ham-fisted wink-nudging to the audience, but it's also a bit of a skeleton key to what the film has to say about the repression and prudish patriarchal attitudes that contextualize her tragic arc, as well as about today's conventions. We fancy ourselves an advanced society, but there's still so much we don't know about science, medicine, the nature of the world. We consider ourselves progressive, but there's something not only contemporary about Hutter and Ellen's marital spat and their social dynamic with the Hardings, but even timeless. This is not exactly the film's most fleshed out idea, nor should it be, but I think it shapes the character dynamics ever so slightly more. Murnau's Nosferatu, likely due to restraints of the period, is sparse about the story's psychosexual throughline. Just as the dialogue becomes more and more pronounced gradually across the three films, so too does this erotic angle. Kinski's Orlok is clearly attracted on a primal level to both Hutter and Ellen, but never does it manifest as anything more than the subtext of blood-sucking, even in the film's climax when he's at his most uninhibited. Restraint is not something Eggers takes particularly seriously here. Skarsgård's Orlok is actually more similar to the womanizing fuck machine Gary Oldman plays in Coppola's film than the tortured outcast Shrek and Kinski play. While this Orlok's attraction to Thomas doesn't amount to anything more than sucking him off, sucking his blood in the missionary position, there's no veiling the fact that Ellen fucks him to death. This explicit punch-up doesn't just serve the purpose of satisfying an increasingly desensitized audience, though. We need this explicit confirmation of the sex element to understand how Ellen challenges Hutter, not just as a man or a lover, but as someone who is capable of knowing her with the kind of oneness that can only be achieved through lovemaking. This oneness is reinforced throughout the film by Ellen and Orlok's shadows and the cross-cutting between the two as Hutter attempts to kill Orlok early on, another device borrowed from past Nosferatus. So her ultimate sacrifice, while on a mechanical level basically consists of her just stalling Orlok with blood and sex until sunlight kills him, feels more like a nuclear fusion of souls. The relationship this film has with older cinema, and this interplay of erotic content, strikes a chord not dissimilar to what I discussed earlier this year about Challengers and its weaponization of Hays Code-esque censorship to make something even more explosive. But while Depp's Ellen may be the Tashi Duncan of Hutter and Orlok's beef, the movie is much more sexually forthcoming than Challengers, liberating Ellen from societal restraints and allowing her to take agency of her own life, however fleetingly. The irony, of course, is that succumbing to darkness and indulging her latent desire for Orlok, even with the intent of killing him, is punished by society, by Orlok, by darkness itself, by her own unwillingness to accept her desires. Who am I to say? This literalizing of the original story's subtext may irk some folks. It may come off as a flattening of the original's universality that erases potential alternative readings. Just as I discussed earlier with the film initially looking like the epitome of modern horror lighting, this execution of the story may strike some as the elevated horrorification of Nosferatu. I find this to be a very funny idea because, to me, Dracula has always been the go-to counterpoint to the very premise of elevated horror. In its infinite readability, Dracula is tangible proof that horror has not only always been elevated, but actually more elevated than the more recent surface-level, one metaphor applies approach of such films as The Babadook. For this reason, a Dracula adaptation feels like the final frontier of elevated horror. To talk about this further, I have to cite Adam Naiman, who accurately describes Egger as the dual-use punching bag and poster boy of the nebulous discourse around elevated horror. Naiman also rightfully shames anyone who attempts to opine on the subject, but I'm gonna do it anyway. While his assessment of Egger's finicky position in the zeitgeist is correct, I don't personally find him to be a director who fits the bill that well. At the heart of the elevated horror thesis, if such a thing exists, is the idea that a given film is veiling a specific idea, a puzzle to be decoded. Egger's past work hasn't really operated with any sort of specific grand metaphor, and if anything often strives to actively obscure any strict readings. His approach prioritizes the experience of watching a movie, and the tactility of older formats and period detail over anything we could possibly explicate from the text. It just so happens that that sensory experience, and the particular aesthetics Eggers leans into, have had much influence on the movement. But he is, by admittedly anecdotal account, on the elevated horror Mount Rushmore nonetheless. The irony is that he's been trying to make Nosferatu since 2015, the year his debut feature The Witch was released. In other words, he had to unwittingly become the face of elevated horror in order to make a film whose source material rebuts the very concept of elevated horror. And you can point fingers and claim that his latest falls into all the trappings of this movement, but what is Eggers actually guilty of here? Taking an existing framework and using it to express himself? Lock 'em up, boys. And more importantly, he fulfills the basic obligations of a horror film here in ways I don't even think his previous work really has, both for better and for worse. The movie perhaps falls victim to some bass-boosted bois and low-hanging jump scares at times, but I have to commend Eggers for weaponizing the compactness of this film in its actorly dramatic mode to make it feel truly penetrating when something even mildly violent happens. Something as simple as sticking a needle through an arm is so unflinching that it becomes a scare in and of itself. So imagine when something crazier happens, like Orlok dropping the now bloodless body of a toddler on the ground like it's an American Girl doll. There's gnarly stuff here. Bird eating, necrophilia, the archaic medical practices of the time doubling as some sort of BDSM roleplay. Despite the extended, sophisticated dialogue and admittedly dense pacing, this film is somehow also successful as a piece of roller coaster ride cinema. The Robert Eggers arc has been one of navigating compromise. That's the art of filmmaking in general, but for whatever reason, Eggers' compromises have been aired out more than most of his contemporaries. The Witch shot digital despite his desperate pleading for film, and had to cut most of what was written for Black Phillip in the script, but it put Eggers on the map, earned him a tenure with celluloid, and sparked a whole new wave of compromises from film to film. The Lighthouse had to excise, read circumcise, a shot of a penis set to match cut with The Lighthouse. The Northman, which I find to be his weakest personally, suffers from clashing ideas resulting in a disjointed edit, and was, in Eggers' own words, another film where he wanted penises and didn't get them. So if that's the only metric we have to go off of, then despite the hurdles Nosferatu faced in pre-production, I believe the sinister shadow Eggers casts around Count Orlok's flaccid member speaks to the triumph that was getting this film made at all. It may not be his most uncompromising film, I think he pretty much otherwise got everything he asked for in The Lighthouse, but one gets the sense that he is only getting better at navigating his plague-ridden ship into the harbor. That's it for me this time around on Nosferatu 2024. I guess technically the only Nosferatu movie that is just called Nosferatu. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. There's just so much bonus content on Patreon. I am drowning in it. And if drowning sounds like a fun thing for you to do, consider clicking the link in the description. Thank you for watching. Like, share, comment, subscribe, do all the regular CTA shit, and happy holidays.